We're so excited to have you here with us this afternoon. We're always excited when you visit the Driskell Center. We think the Driskell Center is a very rare institution committed to the legacy of one rare individual. And we try our best to celebrate those achievements by Dr. Driskell and what those achievements represent. The celebration of the African American visual arts legacy within the context of its cultural practices. And this exhibition of Carol Walker's work is within that vision and within that mission. She's a very important artist, one of the most important artists practicing today, and our esteemed panel will highlight her importance and some of the perhaps controversies surrounding her work. And again, that is part of our mission at the Driskell Center, to advance a dialogue about practices, about meaning, and about value of work produced by artists that are connected to the African American tradition. My name is Professor Houghton. I'm the Executive Director of the David C. Driskell Center, and again, I welcome all of you to this very special event. I'm going to have Dorit Iran, my esteemed colleague and Deputy Director, who's going to come up and introduce our chair of the panel, Dr. Michele Wallace, who will present each member of the panel as well as a presentation of her position on Carol Walker's work. She had a fantastic article just published in a journal of print. And we have a very special event planned for you that I can't speak about, but it is in the context of the exhibition. And again, it points to our evolving mission at the Driskell Center to present very contemporary work and very relevant work to our audience. Dorit.
Thank you, Curly. Good afternoon. And as Professor Houghton mentioned, we are very excited to see all of you here for this exciting event. And I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for today's panel, Dr. Michele Wallace. Dr. Wallace is an author and professor of English, African Studies, Women's Study, and Film Studies in the PhD program in English at the CUNY Graduate Center at the City College of New York. She earned her BA and MA in English from the City College of New York and her PhD in Cinema Studies from New York University in 1999. A feminist author, she published as early as the age of 27 the book of Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman, and a book in which she criticized Black nationalism and sexism. Her other books include Invisibility Blues and other books that she published in 2008 and 2004. Wallace continued to maintain and contribute regularly to several blogs, and her essay on Carol Walker exhibition, Carol Walker Works of Art, Controversial Yet Fascinating, was recently published in the Journal of the Print World. Copies are available at the main desk of the gallery. She is the daughter of the artist Faith Ringgold, and in 2008, she founded the Faith Ringgold Society to study and document the art and career of her mother. Please welcome Dr. Wallace.
Hello. I think there's actually been 3 occasions upon which I've written about Carol Walker. The first time was at an earlier stage in her career, and it was published in a book. Not sure what the name of the book was, but anyway, that was at an early stage, and I welcomed her arrival. Then there was a retrospective that happened at the Walker in Minneapolis, and I was asked to write an essay for that. I wrote that essay, I was paid for that essay, but they didn't like that essay. And they paid me not to publish it, and then also not to publish it for a certain amount of time, which I proceeded to do. But then it became, I don't know, impossible to publish. You know, the publishing environment is very, very different. It's long, and I'm going to read you some of it today, the beginning of it, which I think is still apt. And then there's the third piece, which is in connection with this exhibition. And today's the first day I'm seeing these pieces full size. Carol Walker's quite a person. I'm going to do this first, and then I'm going to introduce the other panelists because I'll feel much better once I get it over with. My piece is called Carol Walker, the Negress and the Writer, and I start with a historical quote from one of my favorite historians, aside from Dr. Berlin, who is also one of my favorites, and who I'm actually using right now in a course anyway, about slaves in New York. That project on slavery in New York has just really changed my life and everybody's life. But anyway, since Europeans, this is from David Bryan Davis's book, Inhuman Bondage, The Rise and Fall of Slavery in the New World. Since Europeans in every region were enslaved in Roman and early medieval times, to say nothing of Asia and Africa, and since Barbary corsairs continued to enslave white Europeans and Americans well into the 19th century, it seems highly probable that if we could go back far enough in time, we would discover that all of us reading these words are the descendants of both slaves and masters in some part of the world. It was not until the 17th century that even New World slavery began to be overwhelmingly associated with people of Black African descent as opposed to Native Americans. That's his quote. Sometimes the tools one uses to consider a topic are making it more depressing and hopeless than it actually is. Something like this may be going on with Carol Walker's highly imaginative yet morose and obsessively negative, some would say dark, in quotes, meditations and variations on the history of slavery, racism, and racial stereotypes. I offer in evidence for such a suggestion the extraordinary accumulation of research and data on the progression of the African slave trade in the New World in general, and on the history of the peculiar institution in the New World and in the North American colonies in particular. Such research and speculation has largely surfaced, not coincidentally, in the 3 or 4 decades since the political and legal breakthroughs of the civil rights movement. Secondarily, I offer in evidence as well the accumulative knowledge of folklorist and collector of negrophilia, Zora Neale Hurston. Her beat as a writer, performer, and playwright was largely composed of intersections of stereotypes and otherwise authentic soundings and viewings of African American folklore in the southern US, Jamaica, the Virgin Islands, and Haiti back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, at the veritable height of the hegemony of Jim Crow politics and segregation in the South. Like Walker, Hurston could not resist pumping those pesky little stereotypes for their residual richness and vigor. In the case of the scholarship on colonial North American slavery and the slave trade, I'm a little embarrassed to suggest that there may be areas in this field of knowledge of which Walker might benefit from in her undertaking, since I suspect that her readings on such matters are both vast and deep, or I hope at least. Yet any mere inventory of the revelations and discoveries of this field would not necessarily be sufficient to render apparent its possible relevance to the remobilization of antiquated cultural forms and artifacts. Rather, I propose a particular reading, a particular synthesis of the scholarship, largely culled from the pages of the brilliant and masterful, then recent book, Inhuman Bondage, The Rise and Fall of Slavery in the New World, by the Yale professor emeritus and US historian David Bryan Davis. Those readers who may have similar interests could do worse than to sit down and read this entire book. On the evolution of racial stereotypes and their symbiotic relationship with slavery, Davis has written, recent scholarship has immensely enriched our knowledge of medieval European stereotypes, of the supposedly black-skinned serfs and peasants who were darkened by dirt and by labor in the sun, of early Arab stereotypes of Black African slaves, millions of whom were transported from East Africa to the Near East, and of the story of the biblical Noah, whose curse subjected all the descendants of Canaan, the son of Noah's own misbehaving son Ham, to the lowliest form of eternal bondage, unquote. Owing to the mixed messages and the religious culpability at every step of the development of the African diasporic slave trade, this absurd business about Noah, Ham, and the descendants of Canaan, as mentioned in the Bible, actually continued to be regarded as conclusive for centuries in the Christian world. Or as Davis further writes, the confusing biblical passage became for many centuries a major justification for black slavery. Thus, a succession of popes in the mid-14th century, confronted by the threatening expansion of Islam, saw enslavement as an instrument for Christian conversion and gave religious approval to the Portuguese ventures along the western coast of Africa, including the shipment of African slaves back to Europe. There is to consider, unquote, there is to consider as well the still inexplicable survival of African American slaves from generation to generation, while practically all the rest of the slaves throughout the diaspora perished in less than a generation, even as they were being constantly replaced by an endless flood of bodies transported from various portions of the African continent. Even though colonial North America, quote, received only 5 to 6% of the African slaves stripped across the Atlantic, nonetheless, it was these persons who, quote, developed an almost unique, natural, and rapid rate of population growth, freeing the later U.S. from a need for further African imports, unquote. On the other hand, vast numbers of African slaves, quote, were imported and disappeared without a trace in some lands such as Mexico and Peru because of the harsh exploitation of largely male slaves, unquote. As we reconsider this vast terrain of human despair and misery spanning centuries, it still seems all the more remarkable that concepts of freedom, emancipation, and the liberation of the slave from bondage would make their appearance precisely in the late 18th century, early 19th century world of the North American and Caribbean colonies, in which slavery was so crucial a form of labor and production. This collective and politicized longing for freedom and liberty, which simultaneously inflicted both slave masters and slaves, did not just spring up whenever and wherever there were slaves, but rather first on the occasion of the American Revolution and then in connections between the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution. As central a figure as President John Quincy Adams apparently provided secret help Toussaint Louverture's rebellion against Napoleon, because he saw this revolt of former slaves as he had also seen the abrogated rights of the kidnapped persons on the Amistad when he found it necessary to appeal their case in the U.S. Supreme Court. Davis writes, "I emphasize the truly revolutionary meaning of the Civil War, reinforced by the fact that the Union confiscated without compensation a hitherto legally accepted form of property that was worth an estimated $3.5 billion in 1860 dollars. Most other emancipations in the Western Hemisphere provided slaveholders with compensation, and there were some cases compensation here too, often in the form of unpaid labor from the freeborn children of slaves or slaves who were required to work until age 18 or a good bit older, unquote. Or, as historian of the South David Blight points out in Race and Reunion, the revolutionary meaning of the Civil War was repressed and transformed from the 1880s to the late 1950s. In other words, he said, this was a memory in which race and slavery were never mentioned. Fortunately, the tradition of denial never wiped out an emancipationist tradition, kept alive by such black writers as Du Bois, which helped inspire the civil rights movement in the 60s and which transformed at least our academic understanding of the rise and fall of racial slavery, unquote. In the universe that Carol Walker creates, it sometimes feels as though some of this was ever so. Her stories, which are all about race and anger, tend toward the cryptic, elliptical, evasive, and inscrutable. They would seem to force into existence a narrative obsessively postmodern in its lack of diachronic development or cues concerning the genealogy of black stereotypes. Only the most perversely unloving and unequivocal forms of sexual contact between masters, mistresses, and slaves are ever allowed in her universe. In this scenario as constructed by Walker, there really is no sign of polemic, either yay or nay, as yet. No Emancipation Proclamation, no Niagara Movement, nor Civil Rights Movement. No NAACP Legal Defense Fund, no Brown versus the Board of Education, nor is it exactly a Ku Klux Klan pep rally either. But it pains me to point out that there is more of a dash of Eldridge Cleaver and Soul on Ice, together with a troubling lack of novelty in her approach to the subject of racial contact in general. Not that an artist is necessarily obligated to pay attention to such things in her work. That's the introduction to my essay. Give you a little bit of